Once again, we welcome you to another episode of Moving Forward with Young Voices. And today we are happy to welcome our first contributor. Her name is Alyssa Norris. Alyssa, I want to welcome you to the show for the sake of people who are meeting you for the first time. Take a moment and tell us about yourself and, who you are, what you do, and the hats that you wear.
Certainly. Well, happy to be on the show again. My name is Alyssa Norris. My background is in civil and environmental engineering. I've spent most of my career working on renewable energy projects across the United States, primarily in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska. And I currently work for a company that does sustainable aviation fuel. I'm very interested in bringing that cost down so it's affordable for everyone, particularly here in the United States. And making the world, at least a little bit cleaner with less pollution. So that's a little bit about me.
I'm looking at an article that you wrote for realclearenergy.org. And I think you bring up a really timely point, and that is sometimes it feels like we're being offered a choice between, okay, you can have clean energy, but you got to give up a number of things. You make the case here that clean energy depends on domestic resources and the American worker. Can we have all those things and still have clean energy? What are some of the hurdles that people sometimes would say, you have to choose one or the other?
Sure. So I think that this is really a false narrative that has been pushed, frankly, by both sides for far too long. There's this idea, and I would say on the far left, that clean energy is all about the environment, and you need to spend more money in order to get that. And the Republicans, specifically around this area, of course, want domestic jobs and don't want to pay an arm and a leg at the pump. So there is absolutely a happy medium here. I think we're starting to see this with the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed about a year ago. Over the past few decades, we've seen a lot more jobs, primarily in red states that were tied to fossil fuels, such as coal, oil, and gas jobs diminish. And over the past year, there's been particular emphasis on bringing back jobs to those areas through clean energy, which frankly is a long time coming. It's taken far too long. But I do think that we're starting to see that. And that's really the only way that the clean energy transition is possible. I don't think anyone wants an environment where they can't breathe or have dirty water. But again, we need jobs. We need to have a thriving economy, and we need to make smart financial decisions and make sure that production is here in the United States, especially if we're the ones paying for it.
What are the major roadblocks to domestic production? You mentioned that we've seen, especially particularly in coal and natural gas and so forth and oil, there has been definitely a regulatory clamping down, but for us to have domestic production, does this include, for instance, lithium and other rare earth metals, that we get from China or other places?
Certainly. So that there's been a ton of what I would call offshore transition of these jobs and transition of these natural resources. The United States has so much to offer. Again, from a resource development perspective, we have a lot of copper, gold, even lithium here in the United States. And if that's developed well, then we can keep those jobs and keep those resources here. I think we're starting to see some of those permits change. There's, for decades with the EPA's creation and EPA permitting rules, there's been a lot of stringencies, and sometimes that's been taken too far. There is a way to develop these, particularly rare earth minerals, in an environmentally conscious way, while still keeping that funding and those jobs here in the States. We're seeing a little bit of relaxation, not as much on the mining side, but on the air permitting side. For example, the state of Washington recently passed rules that if you're creating a sustainable aviation fuel or a sustainable fuel plant, some of those permitting regulations are now relaxed. And I think states across the nation and even the entire country itself is realizing that in some cases maybe we went too far, and that's really putting up a barrier to be able to create or develop different projects that can help and are imperative to the clean energy transition. So I think we're seeing a little bit more sanity and a little bit more maybe a happy medium that fits the bill for both.
It sure feels like that pendulum swings hard one way or the other. I mean, in your article, you reference Oliver Anthony's song, Rich Men North of Richmond. And, it laments what's happened to, much of the blue collar workers who have seen jobs shut down and the energy sector, diminished. But at the same time, who stands in the way of finding that happy medium? Is it the politics, the nature of Republicans versus Democrats, or are there other interests that also are at play in making sure that it doesn't go too easily to that middle ground?
Sure. I think a lot of it, frankly, has been politics. So again, kind of making it an all or nothing, led by activists on primarily the left or environmentalists, looking for the kind of what I call a golden solution, maybe that doesn't take into place some of these transition options that will get us to a better place. You can't just automatically find utopia. There are steps and things that need to be done in order to get there. So I think on one side you have that, and kind of as a knee-jerk reaction, you've seen on the other side some additional roadblocks. I think that really is a lot of it, as well as, living in the global economy that we do. It was a lot cheaper and a lot easier to, again, offshore a lot of those jobs and a lot of those development to developing countries. A lot of third world countries have benefited in a lot of ways by having lithium mines or copper mines or things that traditionally would have been built or produced here in the United States move over to other places because it was so much less expensive. And there weren't nearly as many permitting or regulatory roadblocks in place. So again, I think there's a happy medium. We want to protect all workers and protect the environment, but you have to have jobs and be able to have a thriving economy.
Interesting. I really appreciate that you're explaining it in these terms, because I always, when I hear people talk, whether it's climate activists or whether it's oil and gas industry lobbyists, it really does seem like, look, it can only be this way or it can only be that way, and it. Where do the incentives come from for the companies, to come more toward clean energy, and for the climate activists to come towards, we need, to be able to have economic flourishing as well as pursuing that clean energy option?
Sure. So a lot of that, I think, really is in the Inflation Reduction Act. There's over $370 billion that are set aside to invest in clean energy production. And the key word here that I want to focus on is investing. That indicates that there should be a payback of some sort. In this case, financial as well as positive for the American people. This it's not a charity. It's not, just a grant where they're giving out money. But again, they want to see with this legislation, that money and those jobs come back to the United States and further spur the economy. So I think that's a really, really big distinction that needs to be talked about, particularly for the clean energy transition. Again, it's not a charity case. The economics have to work, and we're investing with the intent of a payback.
Now, currently, I have a son who is studying renewable energy, and in particular, learning to build and work on wind turbines, which the wind apparently blows a lot in the part of the country where I live. But I'm curious if the wind and solar approaches are going to be able to catch up to where they're actually profitable. And please correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding is that. For all the good that they do, they're still quite expensive. It's hard to get that return on investment. Is there any truth to that?
Sure. So I think we're seeing the gap close more and more, but right now they're not economically sound without the incentives, and we need to get to a place where that is true. Again, that gap is lessening year in year in and year out, but that's really the way that we need to be moving. And I think that other clean energy projects like fuel will also move in that direction. But it needs to happen in order to be sustainable.
Got about 30 seconds here. Just one last quick question. Will there ever come a time where government won't have to be a moving force behind this? In other words, where the market will demand it and support it to where it doesn't need subsidizing?
Certainly. I hope so. I think we're seeing small sectors of the private industry making these changes and requiring clean energy. So I think that is headed in the right direction. But right now, we're not quite there yet. Again, for this to be sustainable and good for the American people and globally, it has to be a good investment. And we want those economic payoffs.
Again, we are talking with Alyssa Norris. She's an engineer and also a contributor for Young Voices. Where can people find you on social media?
So I'm on LinkedIn, Alyssa Norris at Aether Fuels.
Once again, we welcome you back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Getting to meet some new faces and voices this week on the program. I want to welcome Ben Cribbin. He joins us from the UK. And Ben, for the sake of folks who are meeting you for the first time, in addition to being a Young Voices contributor, tell us just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
So, my name is Ben. At the moment, I'm based in the UK, but I've lived in Paris and in Germany in the last few years. So I'm something of a wanderer as an English teacher in several countries. I'm also at the beginning of my writing journey. I'm finding things that interest me to write about. For example, Labour's green policies, intentional communities, new ways of forming communities. So that's who I am at the moment.
All right. Now, I'll admit, I don't have on my radar screen a lot of what is going on politically as far as the political races in the UK, but you have a wonderful article on ecohustler.com about 4 green policies that are both popular, that make clear economic sense, and could actually help win votes for the Labour Party. Talk to me a little bit about why the Labour Party needs votes. And talk to me about how these green policies, we can go into some detail as to what these green policies are and why they would actually be a safe bet politically.
Sure. Well, let me maybe back up with the political situation in the UK. We're about a year away from a general election. The Labour Party is currently leading by about 44% to 26% in the opinion polls. It doesn't seem to have changed. Over the summer, there was one particular small election which the Conservatives won. And it was seen at the time that this was in opposition to a particular green policy that Labour had put in place called the ultra-low emission zone, which is a policy designed to penalise drivers of old polluting cars in London. And the Conservatives won that. And that raised the question, could this be the way that the Conservatives snapped the victory back from Labour? Could they distinguish themselves as the party on the side of the people and Labour as the eco-fanatic, is a phrase they've used? So I was investigating that, and my conclusion so far was no. The polls haven't changed that much, and I really think that there is a majority in favour of green policies in general. And so that was what I was interested in. And I thought I would explore some that I thought would be both economically viable and popular.
I appreciate the background on that. And again, I thank you for bringing me up to speed. First of all, I just give me a general feel as far as green policies. How does the average voter in the UK feel about this? Do they see that as a positive thing, or do they feel like it's something that is maybe being forced on them?
Well, that's a good question. There has been polling to suggest about 75% of the population support reaching net zero by 2050. 72%. For Conservative voters, according to one poll, it was slightly higher, it was 73%. So, in my opinion, I think there is a general support of green policies in general. Perhaps the specifics and how we get there, maybe less so. Like banning gas boilers is somewhat less popular. And these ultra-low emission zones in London and soon other cities are more controversial because they may seem to penalize poorer people who have older cars. But in general, I think there is a majority support for environmental action in some sense, if that's clear.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I have been seeing quite a few headlines about those ultra low emission zones, and it appears there's some disagreement here and there. But talk to me about the policies that make the most sense, though, and in other words, ways that green policies could be implemented without undermining the economy and basically forcing everyone to take a step down in their standard of living.
Yeah, so I went for 4 in my article. First one I went for was wind. Interesting facts, I found out that since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Ukraine has built 20 new wind power turbines. The UK has managed 2. So we're doing somewhat worse than a country currently involved in a conflict. And that's because of some planning regulations. It is very hard to build new wind turbines in the UK. One complaint from a resident can derail the whole project. So that was my first policy. My first suggested policy would be to reverse that particular planning law, so that we can increase the number of wind farms. I think there is a consensus that they can provide a lot of cheap energy. We're a windy isle. We have lots of wind tunnels. We have transport corridors like the sides of motorways and railways, where we can build them so we're not blighting kind of the open countryside too much. And there was also a study I remember reading. If we built wind farms everywhere, which we won't, we could generate something like 140% of the power we currently need. So wind seems like a no-brainer.
Okay. Talk to me about the river pollution situation.
Yes. I don't know if this makes the American media, but throughout this year, this has been a recurring story in British media. It's the state of the British rivers, polluted from sewage overflows, from storm drains overflowing. And something I found and wanted to write more about is it's not just sewage. Like, we hear a lot about that. Farming, very sadly, does cause quite a bit of river pollution in the UK. It starts up in the highlands or the higher areas where basically farming on land that should be used to drain and to absorb water means the water runs off into the rivers and causes floods. And there have been some high-profile floods in Somerset about 10 years ago that were caused by that problem. Then we get downriver, and from the fields, it's the pesticides, it's the fertilizers, it's one in particular called slurry that come off the fields into the rivers. For me, it makes pretty clear economic sense that if our rivers are dirty, it costs us more to clean them because we need them for drinking water, we need them for other purposes. So what I would suggest, my point here was properly fund the river regulating bodies like Natural England, other bodies that would police the rivers and try and look for these pollution spills and other forms of pollution, so we can stop it at source. And that's it seems like a cheaper way of doing it than spending more to clean it up, I think.
Okay. We've got about 2 minutes left. Let's touch on the petrol car ban that should be in place by 2030. How ambitious is that ban? Are they looking to just stop the sale of gas-powered vehicles by that time, or are they looking to actually get the existing ones off the road?
Well, the Conservatives have just pushed it back to 2035. So they think it's ambitious. Labour say it's 2030. To me, it seems ambitious. Maybe 2035 is the better target. As well as that, we need to improve the infrastructure. Like, we don't have enough charging points. We have nowhere near as many as France. So that's a key thing, as well as removing the petrol cars, building the infrastructure for the electric vehicles.
Okay, we've got about 1 minute left here. Finally, you talk about making the economic case for green energy. What does that look like?
That looks like changing the conversation from doom and gloom is important to the economy. Just use a phrase from American politics, it's the economy, stupid. That's what gets people voted. That's what wins elections. And I think, having written this, and there is some evidence for this, that there is an economic case to green policies and building the green economy, investing in our green infrastructure. And I think that's a good way for Labour to win the next election, prove that they're the party of economic sense and the environment.
Okay, again, we are talking with Ben Cribbin. He is a Young Voices contributor as well as you pointed out, a wanderer of sorts. Ben, where can people follow you either on social media or where can they access your work?
Yes, so I have a Substack called Rosaries, the Catholic prayer book, and I'm on Twitter at BA Cribbin. Put that in, that's my Twitter handle, and I would love to see you there.
All right, very good, very informative, and you covered a lot of material in a very short amount of time.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, I hope we talk again soon. Thanks, Ben.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. I'm happy to welcome a new Young Voices contributor to this segment of the show. I want to welcome Jonas Du. Jonas, first of all, did I get your last name correct? Did I say it correctly?
Yes, that's correct.
All right. People are meeting you for the very first time. We know you're a Young Voices contributor, but take just a moment. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I'm currently a undergraduate junior at Columbia University. I study political science and economics, and I run a magazine called the Columbia Independent. And our mission is to promote free speech, promote discourse, sort of unite the two sides of, campus political battles and create a space where people can sort of express their views. And through that, I've sort of had a lot of conversations with people on the left and people on the right. And I've been very interested in sort of understanding how our generation thinks politically and what are the issues that matter to our generation.
Okay, and of course, with the upcoming presidential election next year, your generation is playing an increasingly larger role as they are coming in as voters. I'm looking at an article that you wrote for USA Today about how Trump and the GOP turn off young voters. And I thought, boy, this is a good topic because I've observed that as well, just out there in the Twitter sphere or whatever X is called these days. It seems like Trump has a very difficult time gaining traction. And I guess by extension, so do some of the old school GOP members. Talk to me about where the disconnect is. Why is it that younger voters just don't resonate with either Trump or the GOP?
Yeah, so I think that's an excellent question to raise. And I think the first thing that I would point to is, I guess, just personality wise. I think our generation, we're young people. We came of age. We were in middle school, high school when Trump was running. So we don't really understand policy too much. So what do we look to? We look to the TV appearances. We look to how he's presenting himself. And while his rhetoric, his sort of political incorrectness is very appealing to a certain kind of voter, it's just not appealing to young people. People are very turned off by that kind of very just oftentimes very disrespectful language. So I think that was the first impression that he left, and it was not a very good impression. And I think the second thing I would point to is I think young people of all generations, of most generations generally, tend to be liberal, but especially Gen Z, because you look at the things that we grew up around. We grew up around COVID, around global warming becoming an increasingly large issue, around these viral videos of police shootings. And this is all exacerbated by social media, which is creating a lot of anxiety about our futures, about the future of the country. Young people care a lot about the direction society, the country, and the world is headed. And I think with the internet, these issues have become really accentuated, and young people do tend to look to government as a solution for that, unfortunately, in my opinion. And I think that the conservative movement, especially with all of the distractions of MAGA, they've been unable to provide that.
I'm looking back to when I cast my first vote in a presidential election, and I was 18 years old, and it was for Ronald Reagan, back in 1984. And it was a very different face. Conservatism looked a lot different. There was much more decorum and respect among the candidates, even when they vigorously disagreed. Lately, it seems like politics has become almost a blood sport. And I'm just curious, is it the negative, the name calling, or do the policies play into the hesitancy that Gen Z has in supporting, GOP candidates?
I think policy is one big part, but I would say first and foremost, it's about more social things. It's about social issues, about the things that you see first when you look up the candidates, right? So like, how is this candidate presenting themselves? Do I perceive this candidate as someone who's racist, as a good person? I think these are the things that they look to. But also at a school like Columbia, there are a lot of policy discussions going on, and there are a lot of young people that do care about policy. And something that I consistently hear from people that are on the left, even a lot of moderates, is that conservatives simply don't seem like they are providing solutions. I mean, we have young people graduating from even Ivy League universities who are unable to buy a home, even rent a home, start a family, pursue a job that is, well paying and stable. And when you have people faced with these challenges, they don't see the appeal in conservatism. Conservatism hasn't provided a solution to, the rising cost of living and the other concerns that I've mentioned.
Okay. I mean, one thing you point out in your article is that, the woke movement isn't really resonating with every young person. I know sometimes older generations will stereotype, everybody's a snowflake, and, it's all because they're all woke. That's not necessarily true. In fact, I've seen some very freedom-minded members of Generation Z that I think are exemplary. However, what exactly does the GOP stand for? Sure, we're against what the Democrats are doing, but talk to me, Jonas, about, does the GOP do an even adequate job of communicating what it stands for?
I don't think so at all, actually. I think that the GOP right now is sort of the anti whatever the Democrats are doing party. There's no uniting message. In fact, they didn't even make a platform for the 2020 election, which is ridiculous. So right now you see anti-woke, you see anti-transgender, you see all these antis that they're pushing, and there's no really coherent messaging. And I think freedom, conservatism, that comes in, and that's a real way for the right to be able to actually point to a set of values, to point to a set of principles for things that they positively stand for, instead of just being anti-woke, right? Instead of being anti-woke, we can say that we stand for equality of opportunity. We stand for individual rights. These are things that make sense, right? And when you don't have these kinds of principles, you start to see the effects, right? You can see what's happening in Florida with Ron DeSantis, right? He's fighting woke with big government, which is not exactly a conservative principle, right? In his war on Disney. So when you have something like freedom conservatism, I think it's going to offer a real opportunity for conservatives to actually have a platform.
Now, you mentioned a couple of other groups like College Republicans, Turning Point USA, that likewise are gaining traction. I'm just curious, Jonas, what impact, if any, do you see them having in next year's presidential race? Are they big enough to make some waves that can be seen and felt?
Well, I think that groups like College Republicans, not all College Republican chapters, but many of the more provocative ones, but especially things like Turning Point USA. These are groups that are, yes, inspiring people who are already on the right to go out and vote, but they are also inspiring people on the left to vote in opposition to them. It's sort of the same thing you see in national politics, where when you have polarizing candidates, what happens is the other side comes out more. So I think these groups are doing mobilization, but do I think they're being productive for advancing the interest of the right? No.
Now, and for the sake of those who might think, well, Jonas, it sounds like you're kind of a never Trumper. Actually, it sounds like you worked to reelect Donald Trump in 2020, but you have some pretty solid reasons why he shouldn't be the nominee next year. Talk to me about those reasons.
Yeah, so I think the article, it's a little bit misleading, because I think what you're referring to is a link to a related article that they had just placed poorly. I did not actually support Trump in 2020.
Oh.
That was USA Today's sort of web design error. But what I will say is that I think Gen Z is a never Trump generation. I think Gen Z is open to conservative causes. I think they're open to conservative ideals, but there's just nobody has been capitalizing on that, and nobody on the right has sort of made a concerted effort to actually be a big tent party for our generation.
And is that where they're missing the big opportunity?
I think so, because if you look at the demographic data for 2024, you're going to see that Gen Z and millennials, they're going to make up at least the same proportion of voters as the baby boomer generation and older. So it's, this is going to become, 40-50% of the electorate in the coming elections. So this is where the future is, and this is where they have to focus their attention if they want to win.
Okay, so we got about a minute left, but I have to throw this one at you. Robert Kennedy Jr. He definitely doesn't seem to be at home with either the Republican Party or the Democrat Party. What do you hear among members of Generation Z? Is there any interest whatsoever in his stance?
I don't really think there's too much interest in RFK Jr. I think his conspiracy theories are, yes, they're not the same ones that Trump are pushing, but at the end of the day, they're still conspiracy theories. They are anti-vax theories. These are things that are broadly unpopular. So while there might be some appeal, I don't think there's much mass appeal among Gen Z.
Okay, just wondering. It's shaping up to be a pretty interesting year next year, and it sounds like you've tapped into one of the reasons why. Again, we're talking with Jonas Du. He's a Young Voices contributor. Jonas, for people who would like to follow you, tell us where they can find you on social media, also where they can follow your work.
Absolutely. So they can find me on X, formerly Twitter, at Jonas Y Du, JONAS YDU. And my work is published regularly in my magazine, ColumbiaIndependent.org, as well as through Young Voices.
Welcome back. This is our fourth and final segment today on Moving Forward with Young Voices. Hey, I'm happy to introduce you to Benjamin Garbedian. He is a Young Voices contributor. And Ben, since we're meeting you, or Benjamin rather, do you prefer Ben or Benjamin? What's your preference?
I usually prefer Benjamin.
Okay, Benjamin, tell us a bit about yourself, who you are, what you do.
Yeah, so thanks for having me. I am a young person from southeastern Wisconsin. I've been involved in politics since I was 17. I'm 22 now, finishing up college. And I'm just interested in researching and writing all sorts of different policy areas, specifically more regulatory and sort of what I call really nerdy things, things that won't make mainstream press, but still impacts a lot of people's lives. So I'm a Young Voices contributor, and I'm really happy to be here today.
All right. Well, we're talking about a topic that I know is on a lot of people's minds, and that is clean energy. And I'm looking at an article that you've written about how Illinois is among other states that are, kind of clamoring to be the leaders in that quest for clean energy. And you say that Illinois could go carbon free, but not without nuclear. I'm becoming a big fan of nuclear power. Talk to me about the situation of carbon-free electricity, and how far away are we from a state actually leading out and being able to be carbon-free in terms of their energy?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of nuclear energy generally, and I'm not an energy expert, so I can't say how close a state is to being completely carbon-free with their energy. But I do know this. We don't, in America, physically have the resources needed to be entirely wind power, entirely solar power, hydrothermal, those types of green energy. Nuclear needs to be part of the solution. And it's ironic because up until 2-3 years ago, Illinois is actually a leader in this. They currently get just over 50% of their state's electric consumption from nuclear power plants. So they're doing really great. They have a ban. It's a vestigial ban. About a dozen states have one, left from the 1970s, on building new nuclear power plants in their state. And 2 years ago, in 2021, the governor there, J.B. Pritzker, signed a law that said that they would have 100% renewable electricity by the year 2050. And then there would be benchmarks along the way to sort of scale up to that. So he signed that, and a lot of people, myself included, thought that that would mean that the nuclear moratorium would go away because this is a needed component of the solution. And that didn't happen. The Illinois legislature this session passed a bill that would have repealed the nuclear moratorium, and J.B. Pritzker vetoed it. He cited safety concerns and monopoly concerns, which I think are a little bit overhyped. And so I really don't know what their plan is or how they're going to be able to do this, because they have a legislative mandate to have entirely green electricity, and then they have a legislative mandate that you can't use the most effective way to do that to get there. So they're kind of at a crossroads here.
Yeah, that sounds like they're setting themselves up for kind of an impossible situation. I'm curious, that 1970s legislation, that moratorium on nuclear power plants, did that have its genesis in the aftermath of the 3 Mile Island incident in the late 70s? Was it an overabundance of caution for nuclear power?
Yeah, it's primarily because of 3 Mile Island. That was a near catastrophe, and people were rightfully scared. I mean, the media covered it for the weeks that the crisis was, and the pictures coming out of people fleeing the area around the plant was understandably fearful. But in the decades since, we've gotten incredibly good at nuclear safety and at making sure that those fears are mitigated and are really, really unlikely to ever happen again. But the bans still stay on the books. So there were a lot of these that were passed sort of in a rush. Over the past decade or two, a few of them have been repealed. My home state of Wisconsin actually repealed our nuclear moratorium back in 2015. And some just still have them on the books here. Illinois is one of 12 states that has it still. So yeah, it's out at 3 Mile Island. There was a push to repeal the bans, and then the accident in Fukushima with the hurricane in Japan a number of years ago sort of halted that, because it was another thing that ginned up fears. But the reality is, American safety standards are much different than Japanese safety standards. And also, it's incredibly unlikely for a nuclear power plant to get hit by a hurricane and then a tsunami. I'm sorry, not a hurricane, just a tsunami and an earthquake. And we don't plan for those things to happen every single day. But even if we do, we have contingency plans for when natural disasters happen.
So I'm curious if these small modular nuclear reactors might be partially an answer to this moratorium on creating new power plants. I mean, when we talk about the old school major, big scale power plants, yeah, that's a big deal. And I could see there being a lot of regulatory hurdles to clear. But are these small modular nuclear reactors changing the landscape and making it easier to access nuclear power if that's what a state wants to do?
If there is no ban, those modular reactors, and again, none of them have been built yet, but theoretically, with the plans that we've seen, those modular reactors would make it much easier to put them in cities, closer to cities, in more rural areas. They can provide electricity. I think those are going to be the future, but unfortunately, in the 12 states with these nuclear moratoriums, those still can't be built. They're straight bans on anything involving nuclear power. A couple states have exemptions for research purposes if a university wants to do something, but those aren't capable of electrical generation on the scale that we need to be able to power things other than science experiments.
Okay, hopefully I'm not asking you to act as a fortune teller here, but Benjamin, what would it take for these holdout states to change their minds? Are they doing this just out of habit? Is it just bureaucratic inertia that we have to keep this in place? The landscape, it would appear, has changed. There's been, almost 50 years of safety improvements and safety records that they could look to. It seems like it shouldn't be so difficult to update those policies.
I would think so too, but oftentimes American jurisprudence and legislation is behind the culture because it just takes so long to get this stuff moving. I don't know exactly what it takes. I don't think there's one single linchpin, but I think the culture has to continue to shift. And I think people have to know that these things are in place and that they're preventing Americans from accessing reliable, cheap, and clean power. If you're a person who cares about environmental issues, like, this is a way to do that and to not have to have coal-fired or other types of power plants. Like, nuclear power is reliable and very safe.
So as of this time, at least I'm looking at your article here, it looks like Illinois is not in the lead, but Georgia may actually be in the lead of taking over that clean energy charge. What are the other states we ought to be keeping an eye on that are headed in the right direction on this matter?
There are a couple. It's not necessarily states. It's based on the energy companies wanting to build these things. So Georgia has the only nuclear power plant to be opened in the 21st century currently, and they plan on opening another reactor next year in the spring. It's not necessarily that a state is good or bad on it. It's that a lot of states have opened it up to the market to innovate, and now it's up to electric companies and consumers to want these things. So I think just keep looking to the research and to the people who want to build smaller reactors, more modular reactors, and new types of reactors. The era of giant cooling towers is probably coming to an end, even though that was what was built in Georgia. But I think the future is bright. It just might take a little bit longer to get it going.
And as far as Governor Pritzker's concerns about monopolies, is that always going to be, a challenge? I imagine that even a modest nuclear power plant is going to be a pretty big undertaking. It's going to take some pretty deep pockets to set something like that in motion.
Yeah, it will. And that also comes from just the nature of how electric companies are treated in American legislation. One company has to operate this. You can't really have co-ownership of a power plant, or at least not that I've seen. So it's a concern. I think that it's not as big of a fear. Everybody has to have power. These are regulated as public utilities. But nuclear should be the future, and letting companies innovate with it is actually a way to create competition, because if a company wants to create nuclear power plants and compete against the coal-fired ones, that's competition. That's not a monopoly.
All right, we are talking with Benjamin Garbedian. He is a Young Voices contributor. And Benjamin, where can people follow you on social media? Where can they find your writing?
My social media handle on Twitter, or X now, is @actuallybg.
All right, very good. It's good to talk with you. I hope we get to talk on this subject again.
Thank you. You as well. I appreciate the opportunity.